I'd like to begin by sharing a couple of clips from a sci-fi movie that turns 25 this year.
Time's up.
Are you all right? I saw his thoughts. I saw what they're planning to do. They're like locusts, moving from planet to planet, their whole civilization. After they've consumed every natural resource, they move on. And we're next.
In 1996, I was working on my MA at Notre Dame, and so was in the US when I saw that film, Independence Day. The first scene we saw is iconic. And even though it had been part of trailers, as I sat in the cinema, you could feel the shock in the audience, especially as several US landmarks are destroyed. In the ensuing patriotic, we're going to fight back energy of the film, it was easy to overlook the second scene. But it has stuck with me for 25 years. A poignant commentary on colonialism, including in the Americas. Now, I don't know if it's intended, but science fiction that involves first contact between humans and aliens often has this kind of commentary. Understandable, I guess, as we draw on human behavior, especially Euro-American behavior of the last 400 years. Why else would we assume that aliens, well, they want our resources, or they're here to enslave us, or they're here to treat us like cattle? In recent years, the commentary has become a lot less accidental. Take the film Oblivion. Still portraying aliens as raiding resources, the film includes the premise that the last humans have been fooled by powerful forces, like those Joy Cowley is tempted to listen to. These people believe that they can escape the crisis, even though still on the planet are humanity's remnants, barely holding on. Or Elysium, which takes it up a notch. Who needs aliens? It's humans who have ravaged the earth, and those who have profited have escaped to a utopian space station high above the chaos. Now, the prophet Isaiah didn't write science fiction, but he certainly gave commentary. Chapter 40 is intended to be a word of comfort to the exiles in Babylon. While they wait on God to make a highway in the desert to bring them home, they will receive strength and resilience to face the crisis. But in the midst of this word of comfort, Isaiah slips in a barb of honesty as he poetically describes God stranding over the horizon. He calls people locusts. Certainly not how we see ourselves. In fact, we see ourselves just the opposite. We believe that we are the ones who are enthroned over the earth. And that's the crux of the fall, where mythic first humans are fooled to believe that they can be like gods. The serpent portrays God as distant and pettily making a rule about the tree of knowledge of good and evil, when the whole time God is actually close, animating them with Spirit's breath. But once they eat from the tree, the lie they have told themselves feels true. There's suddenly a gap between them and God, a gap between them and each other. There's a gap between them and creation, a gap that hadn't been there before. And it's that belief that we're above it all, even other humans, a la Elysium, that ironically shows that we are in fact locusts, a la Isaiah and Independence Day. What I mean by this is that the delusional thinking that we're separate and above others, well, it fueled colonialism. It drove Europeans, then North Americans, to first attempt cultural genocide upon indigenous peoples, and then to kidnap and enslave Africans for profit, and to continue effectively enslaving Black peoples long after emancipation. All the time claiming to believe in Jesus, who taught a vastly different vision of the world, one that does not have the colonial project extended all around the world, all in the name of capital, multiple nations and peoples so exploiting plants and animals that they are going extinct and the climate itself teeters on the brink of disaster. Now, the injustices that I just named, we think of them separately, but they're not. They're quite interconnected. Have you ever heard of something called environmental racism? Well, it used to be environmental classism. The working poor lived closer to industry and to its dangers, while wealthier neighborhoods, well, they're situated upwind from all of the hazard. Wealth followed racial patterns, and we ended up not just with racialized neighborhoods, those neighborhoods impacted by these hazards, but also villages and towns impacted as well. And that's where hazardous dumps are built or toxic industries are placed. This is the subject of a report from a couple of years ago in Nova Scotia. They tested water quality and found that predominantly Black and Indigenous communities are often impacted by hazardous waste. A toxic dump just outside of Sherburne. An effluent pond from a pulp and paper production situated close to Pictou Landing First Nation. A sewage treatment plant that had been built near Africville. The pattern repeated across Canada and around the world. And it's not just human impacts. Our industrial attitude impacts animals and plants as well. Take clear cutting in BC. The loss of trees on the slope destabilizes the soil. The silt washes into the creek. Well, that silt covers the pebbles where salmon are supposed to spawn. It collapses the salmon population, which impacts bears, impacts orcas, impacts other wildlife. Ironically, it impacts the trees as well because 30% of the nutrients that the trees use is taken up from the salmon themselves. And this hurts humans, especially impacting Indigenous communities, impacting them economically, culturally, spiritually. It could be different. Companies could select cut instead, but argue that it isn't economically feasible, and we choose to believe them. And that's a key point, because the narratives we choose to believe make all the difference. A common one is the need to choose between economy and environment. But that's based on the idea that we're above it all, that we're separate and apart. And so the economy is somehow separate from the environment as well. And the result is that industry profits, well, it's often the public that foots the bill. That is locust thinking. This old idea forgets that there is no economy without an environment. And we begin to see this when we look at the world from a different angle. Isaiah promises that through God's strength, we will fly like eagles. And when we fly high enough, we will see that we are all interconnected. All people, people and animals, people, animals, and plants, all of life joined to the rocks and the water and the sky. And within all of this is God. This wider perspective is what Joy Cowley speaks about in her poem. And ironically, she gains it not from an eagle's eye view, but by going small. That is by taking the time to look carefully, look closely at the world around us. When we do, we discover that we need the fern frond. We need the bellbird and the dewdrop on the spider's web. We need each other, every person and race and culture. We discover that we're all part of each other. And so rather than ravage the world and exploit each other, we protect one another. We support the world, and we remember that caring for each other and caring for the environment is a way that we care for ourselves. We then realize that the separation that we thought was there was in our minds the whole time. The gap disappears, and God is as close as ever, animating not just people, but animals and plants and earth and sky and the universe. It isn't easy to choose this narrative. We have been listening to the big and powerful, to the voice that turns us into locusts for a very long time. But within us is the call of the eagle, the spirit of children, the voice of God. There we hear an older story than the fall narrative and its narrative of separation and domination. There we hear the story of a garden where we walk with animals, where we take care of the plants, where we have everything that we need. When we listen to that story, we experience the kingdom of God. Amen.